This is the story of how the United States military carried out a surprise raid on Venezuela in the early morning hours of January 3rd, 2026, capturing the country's president and fundamentally altering the political landscape of South America. What started with explosions in Caracas at 2 a.m. ended with Nicolás Maduro, blindfolded and handcuffed, on a U.S. warship, facing drug trafficking charges that could put him in prison for life. Before we get into the details of Operation Absolute Resolve and what it means for Venezuela's future, you need to understand who Nicolás Maduro is, what he's accused of, and how U.S.-Venezuela relations reached this breaking point. The road to crisis. Since 2013, when he took over after Hugo Chavez died, Nicolás Maduro has controlled Venezuela as president, and under the Chavismo government that's run the country since 1999, Venezuela experienced what's been described as the worst economic meltdown in history. Between 2014 and 2025, 8 million Venezuelans fled the country, which represents a quarter of the entire population, driven out by economic failure, spiking crime, and political oppression that made daily life impossible. But the accusations against Maduro go way beyond economic mismanagement. A federal indictment unsealed on January 3, 2026, in the U.S. District Court for the Southern District of New York, charged Maduro and 5 other defendants with 4 criminal counts that include narco-terrorism conspiracy, cocaine importation conspiracy, possession of machine guns and destructive devices, and conspiracy to possess those same weapons. What the indictment alleges is that for more than 25 years, starting in at least 1999, Venezuela's leaders abused their positions of public trust and corrupted once legitimate institutions to import tons of cocaine into the United States. Prosecutors claim Maduro partnered with an organization called the Cartel of the Suns, a name that comes from the sun insignias on Venezuelan military uniforms, and by 2020, the State Department estimated that 200 to 250 tons of cocaine were being trafficked through Venezuela every single year. The indictment gets specific about Maduro's alleged role during different periods of his career. From 2006 to 2008, when he served as Venezuela's Minister of Foreign Affairs, he's accused of selling Venezuelan diplomatic passports to known drug traffickers and facilitating the movement of drug proceeds from Mexico to Venezuela under diplomatic cover. Earlier, when he was a member of the National Assembly from 2000 to 2006, prosecutors claim he moved cocaine loads under Venezuelan law enforcement protection, which meant the very people supposed to stop drug trafficking were helping it happen. As president, the indictment alleges that Maduro allowed cocaine-fueled corruption to flourish for his personal benefit and the benefit of his regime, maintaining state-sponsored gangs called colectivos to protect drug trafficking operations and ordering kidnappings, beatings, and murders against those who owed drug money or undermined these operations. The charges also name 5 other defendants, including Celia Flores, Maduro's wife and Venezuela's First Lady, Nicolás Ernesto Maduro Guerra, who's Maduro's son, Diosdado Cabello Rondon, Venezuela's Interior Minister, Ramon Rodriguez Chacín, a former Interior Minister, and Hector Rustenford Guerrero Flores, who leads a gang called Tren de Aragua. These charges aren't new, though. The initial indictment was announced back in March 2020 by Attorney General William Barr during Trump's first administration, when the U.S. offered a $15 million reward for Maduro's capture and $10 million for Diosdado Cabello, and in 2025 the reward for Maduro was raised to $50 million. The contested election, the immediate trigger for the escalation that led to Maduro's capture, traces back to Venezuela's presidential election on July 28, 2024, and this election and its aftermath would prove to be one of the most controversial in modern Latin American history. Edmundo González Urrutia was the opposition candidate representing the unitary platform, but he wasn't the opposition's first choice. That would be Maria Corina Machado, a Venezuelan opposition leader from the Vent Venezuela party who won the opposition primary in October 2023 with 93% of the vote. But Venezuela's Supreme Court barred her from running in June 2023. Known as the Iron Lady among her supporters, Machado has been described as perhaps the most divisive figure in Venezuelan politics, and her exclusion from the race forced the opposition to rally around González instead. On July 29, 2024, the day after the election took place, Venezuela's National Electoral Council announced that Maduro had won with 51.2% of the vote, compared to Gonzalez's 44.2%. But there was a problem because the CNE never published detailed vote tallies or precinct-level results that would verify these numbers. The opposition wasn't about to accept this without a fight. They had collected and published tally sheets from over 80% of the electronic voting machines, approximately 30,000 machines total, and their count told a completely different story because according to the opposition's data, Gonzalez won with roughly 67% of the vote compared to Maduro's 30%, which is more than a 2-to-1 margin. On August 1, 2024, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken stated that it is clear that Edmundo González Urrutia won the most votes, and the U.S. recognized Gonzalez as the legitimate winner of the 2024 election. Political scientist Stephen Levitsky called it one of the most egregious electoral frauds in modern Latin American history, and even mathematician Terence Tao weighed in, noting oddly round percentages that suggested the election was fixed rather than genuine. The aftermath was brutal for anyone who protested. By July 31, 2024, at least 670 people had been detained, and at least 11 people died in clashes between security forces and protesters who took to the streets. Machado went into hiding, citing fears for her life, and Gonzalez also went into hiding for weeks after the election because speaking out could have gotten them killed. Despite the international outcry and evidence of fraud, Maduro was sworn in for a third term on January 10, 2025, and for her struggle to achieve a just and peaceful transition from dictatorship to democracy, Maria Corina Machado was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in December 2025. She also received the Václav Havel Human Rights Prize, the Sakharov Prize, which she shared with Gonzalez, and the Magnitsky Award for Outstanding Political Opposition Figure in 2024. And Time magazine named her one of its 100 most influential people in 2025. The military buildup. After taking office for his second term on January 20, 2025, President Donald Trump began an aggressive campaign of pressure against the Maduro regime that would escalate month by month. In October 2025, Trump formally notified Congress that the United States was in a non-international armed conflict with unlawful combatants regarding drug cartels, and this notification would become part of the administration's legal justification for military action later. Starting in September 2025, the U.S. Southern Command began conducting military strikes on vessels in the Caribbean Sea that were alleged to be trafficking drugs on behalf of Venezuela. And between September and early January, at least 20 airstrikes were conducted in waters near Venezuela. By early December 2025, at least 95 people had been killed in these boat strikes, and White House Chief of Staff Susie Wiles said in December that Trump wants to keep on blowing boats up until Maduro cries uncle, which gives you a sense of how the administration was thinking about this. The pressure escalated in December when the U.S. Coast Guard seized the oil tanker Skipper off Venezuela's coast on December 10th, and 10 days later on December 20th, they seized a second oil tanker called the Centuries, cutting off Venezuela's ability to export oil and bring in revenue. And that's when Trump made a dramatic announcement via Truth Social on December 16th, 2025. He declared a total and complete blockade of all sanctioned oil tankers going into and out of Venezuela, designated the Venezuelan government as a foreign terrorist organization, and in his post, Trump claimed that Venezuela is completely surrounded by the largest armada ever assembled in the history of South America. By December 17th, the U.S. Navy had 11 ships in the region, including an aircraft carrier and several amphibious assault ships, which was an unprecedented show of force in the Caribbean that sent a clear message to Maduro. Trump's rhetoric became increasingly threatening as December wore on. On December 23rd, he said it would be smart for Maduro to leave power, warning that if he plays tough, it'll be the last time he's ever able to play tough, which was basically a direct threat to Maduro's life or freedom. In late December, the CIA conducted what is believed to be the first known direct U.S. military operation on Venezuelan soil when they carried out a drone strike on a dock area inside Venezuela that was allegedly used by drug cartels. Trump later said this operation was delayed 4 days due to weather conditions. a detail that would become relevant again when the main operation faced similar delays. The Trump administration also took aggressive action against a Venezuelan gang called Tren de Aragua, which had become a major focus of the president's immigration and security rhetoric throughout 2025. Founded in 2014 in Tocaron prison in Aragua State, Venezuela, Tren de Aragua had expanded internationally following the wave of Venezuelan migration, establishing permanent cells in Colombia, Peru, and Chile, with reports of activity in Brazil, Ecuador, Bolivia, and the United States. In July 2024, the U.S. Treasury designated Tren de Aragua as a transnational criminal organization. And on January 20th, 2025, the day of his inauguration, Trump signed an executive order to designate the gang as a foreign terrorist organization. The U.S. offered $12 million total for information leading to the arrest of the gang's leaders, showing how seriously the administration took this threat. The gang's criminal activities included extortion, which was their primary revenue source, along with human trafficking, sexual exploitation, drug trafficking, loan sharking, kidnapping, robberies, and murders that terrorized communities across multiple countries. The FBI confirmed Tren de Aragua was operating in the U.S. in January 2024, with members arrested in Pennsylvania, Florida, New York, Texas, California, Colorado, and New Mexico. One of the gang's most notorious features was how it operated from Tocaron prison before Venezuelan security forces took it over in September 2023. The gang leaders ran a zoo, a swimming pool, a disco, a restaurant, and a bar from inside the prison, which shows you the level of corruption in Venezuela's institutions. But when the government finally moved in, the leadership escaped, and U.S. intelligence believed they were hiding in Colombia. Operation Absolute Resolve. All of this brings us to the early morning hours of January 3rd, 2026, which happens to be exactly 36 years to the day after the U.S. invasion of Panama that led to the capture of Manuel Noriega. And whether that timing was intentional or coincidental remains unclear. At approximately 2 a.m. local time, or 6 a.m. GMT, Operation Absolute Resolve began when residents of Caracas were jolted awake by explosions and the sound of low-flying aircraft. Carmen Hidalgo, a Caracas resident, later described the experience by saying the whole ground shook. "This is horrible. We heard explosions and planes. We felt like the air was hitting us," which captures the terror of being woken up by a military operation. According to Venezuelan Defense Minister Vladimir Pedrino Lopez, more than 150 aircraft were involved in the operation, and at least 7 explosions were reported across the city as the operation targeted multiple sites across northern Venezuela, primarily in and around Caracas, hitting locations in 3 states which were Miranda, Aragua, and La Guaira. Specific targets included La Carlota Military Air Base near central Caracas, Fort Tiuna military installation where Maduro would be captured, the port of La Guaira, which suffered severe damage, and numerous other military bases, airfields, communication facilities, and ports across the region. Venezuelan officials claimed that some civilian neighborhoods were also hit, and southern Caracas lost power during the attack, which meant ordinary people suffered too. The entire operation lasted less than 30 minutes from start to finish. Maduro and his wife, Celia Flores, were at their home within the Fort Tiuna military installation when U.S. forces captured them, and they were taken aboard the USS Iwo Jima before being transported by helicopter to the ship and then flown to New York. Trump later told Fox News that the operation was actually delayed 4 days due to weather, saying the weather was not perfect, which echoed his comments about the earlier CIA drone strike. General Dan Kane, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, revealed that U.S. forces had rehearsed the operation for months, learning about Maduro's habits, pets, clothes, and routines to ensure nothing went wrong. Kane explained that we think, we develop, we train, we rehearse, we debrief. We rehearse again and again, not to get it right, but to ensure we cannot get it wrong, which shows the level of planning that went into this. The U.S. had prepared a second wave of troops in case the first wave encountered problems, but they ultimately weren't needed because the operation went smoothly. There were no U.S. fatalities, though some injuries were reported, including bullet and shrapnel wounds from a helicopter being hit. But these injuries were described as non-life-threatening. The casualty situation on the Venezuelan side is less clear, though. Venezuelan Vice President Delcy Rodriguez confirmed casualties among civilians and military personnel, but provided no specific numbers. And Trump told the New York Post that many Cubans lost their lives protecting Maduro, calling it not a good move. The exact death toll remains unknown to this day. Around 9 a.m. GMT on January 3rd, Trump announced the operation via Truth Social with a post that read, "The United States of America has successfully carried out a large-scale strike against Venezuela and its leader, President Nicolás Maduro, who has been, along with his wife, captured and flown out of the country." Trump also posted a photo showing Maduro in a gray tracksuit, blindfolded with a black band and handcuffed, holding a water bottle aboard the ship. And Trump later said that U.S. forces turned off almost all of the lights in Caracas during the operation. He described it as a brilliant operation, praising the military for their execution. Legal proceedings and immediate aftermath. On the afternoon of January 3rd, Maduro and Flores arrived at Stewart International Airport in New York, where FBI and DEA agents were visible on the tarmac, as the couple was taken into federal custody. They were transported to the Manhattan federal court area to await arraignment. Attorney General Pam Bondi, who had announced the unsealing of the federal indictment filed by U.S. Attorney Jay Clayton, declared that Nicolás Maduro and his wife, Celia Flores, have been indicted in the Southern District of New York, and they will soon face the full wrath of American justice on American soil in American courts. Their arraignment was expected to take place on Monday, January 6, 2026, and the charges they face carry prison time that could mean Maduro spends the rest of his life behind bars if convicted. The Venezuelan government's response was swift and defiant from the moment they understood what had happened. Vice President Delcy Rodriguez stated that Maduro is Venezuela's only president and demanded his immediate release and proof of life, calling the capture a kidnapping and declaring that Venezuela will never again be a colony of any empire. The government said it had lost contact with Maduro and Flores, and their whereabouts were unknown at first, which created confusion about whether they were even alive. Venezuela's Supreme Tribunal of Justice acted quickly, ordering Rodriguez to assume the presidency in Maduro's absence. But Rodriguez maintained that Maduro remained the legitimate president and had not formally assumed power herself. The defense forces were activated, a state of emergency was declared, and the government called on citizens with the rallying cry of people to the streets. International reactions. The international response to the U.S. operation was sharply divided and revealed deep geopolitical fault lines that had been building for years. Russia was among the first to condemn the action, calling it concerning and condemnable while stating that it is important to prevent further escalation and to focus on finding a way out through dialogue. They called for the UN Security Council to convene immediately, and the Foreign Ministry warned that tensions could have unpredictable consequences for the entire West, which was a veiled threat about broader conflict. Cuba's President Miguel Díaz-Canel called it a criminal attack, saying our zone of peace is being brutally assaulted, and Iran's Foreign Affairs Ministry also condemned the strikes, showing solidarity with Venezuela. Colombia's response was notable given its geographic proximity and complex relationship with Venezuela. President Gustavo Petro rejected the aggression against the sovereignty of Venezuela and of Latin America, urging an emergency meeting of the Organization of American States. But here's the thing. Colombia itself does not actually recognize Maduro's government, which made Petro's defense of Venezuelan sovereignty a matter of principle rather than support for the regime. Former Mexican President López Obrador called the U.S. incursion an attack on Venezuela's sovereignty, described Maduro's capture as a kidnapping, and accused the United States of acting as a global tyrant. He quoted former President Benito Juárez, saying that respect for the rights of others is peace, invoking a famous phrase in Mexican history. Even in the United States, New York Mayor Zohran Mamdani spoke out against the operation, stating that unilaterally attacking a sovereign nation is an act of war and a violation of federal and international law, which put him at odds with the Trump administration. On the other side, Argentina's President Javier Milei praised Trump's claim of Maduro's capture, offering one of the few voices of international support for the operation. The United Nations found itself in a difficult position trying to navigate this crisis. Secretary General Antonio Guterres said he was deeply alarmed by the escalation, calling it a dangerous precedent, and worrying that the rules of international law have not been respected, expressing concern about the worrying implications for the region. UN High Commissioner for Human Rights Volker Turk requested restraint while respecting international law, emphasizing that the protection of the people of Venezuela is paramount, which was a diplomatic way of saying everyone needed to calm down. Domestic political response. Within the United States, the operation sparked intense debate about presidential war powers and congressional authority that went to the heart of the Constitution. The Trump administration had informed congressional leaders about the strikes only after the operation had already begun, which raised questions about the separation of powers and whether the president had overstepped. Among Republicans, the response was largely supportive, though not universally so, and that's where things got interesting. Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene initially questioned the justification, asking why no similar action had been taken against Mexican cartels. She accused Trump of seeking regime change for control over Venezuelan oil supplies. But most Republican lawmakers rallied behind the president once the operation succeeded. Representative Mario Diaz-Balart said, "The first of those tyrannies has not survived President Trump. And the next two, Cuba and Nicaragua, their days are also counted," suggesting this was just the beginning. Representative Don Bacon said the capture is great for the future of Venezuelans and the region, though he worried it could embolden other countries to take similar unilateral action. Senator Mike Lee of Utah initially raised constitutional concerns, stating that he looked forward to learning what, if anything, might constitutionally justify this action in the absence of a declaration of war or authorization for the use of military force. Lee later softened his stance after a conversation with Secretary of State Marco Rubio, saying the action likely falls within the president's inherent authority, which was a significant walkback. Democrats were far more critical of the operation across the board. Representative Joaquin Castro of Texas called the blockade unquestionably an act of war, describing it as a war that the Congress never authorized and the American people do not want. He said lawmakers would vote on a resolution directing the president to end hostilities with Venezuela, though whether that resolution would pass remained unclear. Senator Tim Kaine of Virginia introduced a resolution requiring removal of United States armed forces from hostilities within or against Venezuela that have not been authorized by Congress. Kaine said some Republican colleagues told him they thought Trump was bluffing about military action, which shows how many people didn't see this coming. The constitutional questions are profound and won't be resolved quickly. The United States conducted a military operation against a sovereign nation without a congressional declaration of war or authorization for the use of military force, which appears to violate both domestic constitutional requirements and international law principles regarding sovereignty and territorial integrity. Some legal experts have even questioned whether the operation could constitute a war crime under international law, though the Trump administration has its own legal theory. The Trump administration's legal justification rested on the October 2025 notification to Congress that the U.S. was in a non-international armed conflict with unlawful combatants regarding drug cartels. Under the laws of armed conflict, a country can lawfully target enemy fighters even when they pose no immediate threat. And the December 17, 2025 National Defense Authorization Act included a bipartisan amendment requiring Defense Secretary Hegseth to provide unedited footage of strikes and authorizing orders, which may have been seen as tacit congressional approval. The Venezuelan opposition's response from Maria Corina Machado and Edmundo Gonzalez. The news of Maduro's capture represented a potential turning point they had fought years to achieve, risking their lives and freedom in the process. On January 3rd, Machado issued a statement calling for Gonzalez to assume the presidency and saying that faced with his refusal to accept a negotiated exit, the United States government has fulfilled its promise to uphold the law. She called for the restoration of popular and national sovereignty, adding that we have fought for years, we have given everything, and it has been worth it, which captured the emotion of the moment. Gonzalez also spoke out, saying he was ready to rebuild our nation, and that the coming hours would be decisive for Venezuela's future. The United States continued to recognize Gonzalez as the legitimate winner of the 2024 election, creating a complex situation where the U.S. backs an opposition leader while militarily removing the de facto government. But here's the thing. Trump threw cold water on Machado's leadership prospects during a press conference on January 3rd. When asked about her, Trump questioned whether she has the support to lead Venezuela, saying that he thinks it'd be very tough for her to be the leader because she doesn't have the support or the respect within the country. This comment was striking given Machado's Nobel Peace Prize and overwhelming victory in the opposition primary, with 93% of the vote, and it raised questions about who Trump actually wanted to see lead Venezuela. Conclusion: an uncertain future. The capture of Nicolás Maduro on January 3, 2026, marks one of the most dramatic U.S. military operations in Latin America since the end of the Cold War, and Operation Absolute Resolve, conducted by more than 150 aircraft in less than 30 minutes, removed a leader who had held power for nearly 13 years, and who faces federal charges of running a narco state. But removing Maduro is just the beginning of Venezuela's story. The questions about Venezuela's future remain unanswered and deeply uncertain. Will the United States successfully oversee a transition to democracy? Or will the intervention create new instabilities that make things worse? Will the international community accept U.S. actions as justified? Or will this become a precedent that undermines the post-World War II international order built on respect for sovereignty? For the Venezuelan people, both those who remained in the country and the 8 million who fled, Maduro's capture offers hope but no guarantees of a better future. Venezuela's institutions have been corrupted and weakened. After 27 years of Chavismo rule, the country's economy lies in ruins, and rebuilding will take years, perhaps decades, regardless of who leads.